It was an ordinary evening. Too ordinary to be memorable, if not for one passing phrase. The house was quiet except for the clink of dishes being stacked in the kitchen. I stood by the window, cup in hand, the last of my morning coffee gone cold, watching the lavender fade from the sky. Jenna's voice carried faintly from the living room, bright and chipper. My son's laugh followed. That low, easy sound I used to hear from the back seat when he was little and trying to make his father laugh too. I wasn't eavesdropping, just existing. Just standing there, like I always did at that hour, while the house dimmed and the world outside tucked itself in. That's when I heard it. The Maldives villa. The yacht. It's all covered. He said it like he was talking about a pizza order. Not a blink. Not a pause. Jenna laughed too, one of her high, tinkly laughs that always left a thin film of something on my skin. I didn't move. I didn't interrupt. I didn't ask a single question. Maybe I should've. But I've learned, at this age, when you start asking questions you already know the answers to, all you're really doing is giving people a chance to lie. That night, the house was darker than usual. I climbed into bed but didn't sleep. And then, just after 2 a.m, the phone on my nightstand lit up. Transaction approved, $42,000. And the strange part wasn't that I was shocked. It was that I wasn't. Not even a little. More than anything, I remember the work. Not the celebrations, not the milestones, but the effort it took to hold everything together. The snowstorms I drove through for early client meetings. The double shifts I took when Nathan was in high school because tuition deadlines didn't care that I hadn't slept. The polite small talk I mastered at networking events, standing there with aching feet and a strained smile, all because I believed that one more contract might give us a little more breathing room. After Richard died, it wasn't grief that made me numb, it was the endless list of things that still had to be done. I remember walking into the kitchen the morning after his funeral and realizing the garbage still had to go out. That the car still needed gas. That our son still had an English paper due. Nothing paused just because the man I built my life with was suddenly gone. I didn't mourn with drama. I mourned with action. I took our modest savings and the half-finished client list from my part-time interior design business and built something I could live on. That Nathan could lean on. I expanded the business slowly, one satisfied client referring me to another, one consultation turning into a full remodel. I hired help when I could afford it and let go of help when I couldn't. It was never glamorous. But it was mine. And through it all, I prioritized Nathan. Every decision was filtered through the lens of his future. When to downsize. When to stretch. When to say yes, even when it meant saying no to myself. Not because I was trying to buy his love, I never thought of it that way. It just seemed natural to want better for him. I was raised to believe that mothers absorb the burden so their children don't have to. It wasn't until years later that I realized how easy it is to become invisible under the weight of that belief. At first, I chalked things up to youthful carelessness. The missed thank yous, the unreturned calls, the way Jenna always seemed to talk to me like I was an assistant rather than a person. "Louise, can you just check on the caterer?" she once asked before their engagement party, without even glancing up from her phone. I told myself they were busy. That they'd grow out of it. That the real closeness would return once they had their own children, once they had more space in their lives. But that never happened. What changed instead was the nature of the requests. It was no longer, "Could you help us with a bit of rent?" It became, "We'll need your contribution by Friday." The tone changed. The assumptions deepened. They didn't ask, they informed. Not out of malice, maybe. But out of a deep-rooted belief that I was there to facilitate their lives, to make the impossible affordable and the inconvenient disappear. The house down payment. The car after Jenna's accident. The emergency root canal that turned out to be a cosmetic procedure. None of it was ever questioned. None of it repaid. There was a rhythm to it. They asked, I gave, and they moved on. I told myself I was helping them build stability. But I was the only one treating it like a gift. They treated it like a service. And still, I didn't speak up. Maybe I was afraid of what would happen if I did. Maybe I was afraid of what it would say about the years I'd already given. The money was easier to part with than the illusion that we were still close, that I still mattered. So I let the resentment settle into silence. Until that night. When I saw the charge, $42,000, approved on my primary card, I didn't panic. I didn't even blink. Somewhere deep down, I already knew what it was. I opened the full transaction details and saw it plain as day: international travel agency, 2 weeks in the Maldives, private yacht charter. They'd used my name. My financial identity. My trust. And they hadn't thought twice. There was no emergency. No last-minute plea. No story about a health scare or lost job. They hadn't even bothered to ask. Because they were confident I wouldn't notice, or that even if I did, I wouldn't push back. That kind of confidence doesn't come from malice. It comes from long practice. I sat at the kitchen table until the early hours of the morning, the screen light casting shadows on the wallpaper Richard and I had chosen 20 years ago. I wasn't emotional. I was focused. I opened my banking dashboard and froze all cards immediately. Then I logged into the travel site and pulled up the booking. It was listed under my name. Of course it was. I called the agency, calm and professional, and explained that I had not authorized the reservation. The woman on the line listened patiently. She asked the right questions. When I explained the situation, calmly, factually, she said something that caught me off guard. "You're not the first." She didn't elaborate. But her voice carried a kind of tired sympathy I hadn't expected. Like she'd spoken to other women like me. Women who'd been used without being asked. Who weren't seen as people anymore, just access points. The reservation was cancelled. The refund initiated. I repeated the process for the yacht, for the hotel transfers. It was late. I was tired. But I felt more alert than I had in years. Like I was finally standing up after sitting still for too long. I didn't call Nathan. I didn't leave an angry voicemail or type out a speech. I didn't announce what I'd done. For once, I wasn't interested in their reactions. The next morning, I called my attorney, Marlene. We hadn't spoken in over a year, but she remembered me right away. "I need to review some documents," I said. "Update my accounts, shift some access." She didn't ask why. She simply said, "Come in Monday. Bring everything." And I would. It struck me then how much time I'd spent explaining myself in the past. Justifying my choices, softening my tone, pretending everything was mutual when it wasn't. I'd always made room for their perspective, even when they didn't make room for mine. But now, I was acting. Not performing. Not pleading. Just moving forward. By the end of the day, every shared account had been closed. Every access point had been removed. If they tried to make another purchase, they'd find a declined card and no explanation. I didn't plan to give one. That was the part one hadn't expected, the quiet. Not silence as in loneliness, but stillness. Like something inside me had finally stopped buzzing. I wasn't angry. I wasn't vindictive. I was just done. "Let me know when you're ready for part 3. The silence didn't last. By the end of the second day, Jenna had left 3 voicemails, and Nathan sent a message that read, "Did you freeze the card? Something's going on." I saw the notifications come in. I didn't open them. I knew that if I let them sit, untouched, they would show me exactly how long it would take for concern to turn into frustration, and frustration into blame. By the third day, the tone shifted. Jenna's next message was short and clipped. She said the trip was already booked, that they'd made plans based on expectations, and that they were really disappointed I hadn't told them about any issues beforehand. It was the sort of message that assumed we were all equals in this situation, that they had offered me something and I had failed to meet my end of the arrangement. But there had been no arrangement. There had been no conversation at all. On the fourth day, they emailed. I knew it would come eventually. Jenna was always more comfortable with writing than confrontation. The subject line read, "Important, we need to talk." It was her voice throughout the message, not Nathan's, and it was carefully measured, as though she'd rewritten it 3 times before sending. She opened by saying they were confused and disappointed by my decision. She explained how much time she'd spent planning the trip, how excited they'd been, how they had already taken time off work and were now facing non-refundable costs. She said the change had created significant disruption to their plans. Then, in the middle of a long paragraph about financial strain and emotional distress, came the line I had been waiting for. "We're expecting." No exclamation point. No sentiment. Just those 2 words, placed exactly where they would carry the most weight. It wasn't an announcement, it was a justification. An attempt to make me feel that I had not just disrupted a vacation, but jeopardized a future I hadn't yet been invited into. I read the sentence again and again. If they had told me weeks earlier, with joy or even hesitation, I think I would have responded with a kind of warmth. But here, folded into a complaint about cancelled reservations, it landed differently. They didn't want to share the news with me, they wanted to use it. I didn't reply. I didn't even forward it to my attorney, though I could have. There was nothing in that message that changed anything. If anything, it made my position feel more necessary. I spent that weekend at home, sorting through drawers I hadn't touched in years. I found receipts from Nathan's first apartment, dishes, towels, a vacuum. I found a faded school program from when he played a tree in his first grade play. All of it made me feel a kind of steady ache, but not regret. I was a good mother. I had shown up, again and again, and never once asked to be repaid for it. But I also saw clearly how the giving had turned into an expectation, and how love had slowly been replaced with convenience. By Monday, I was ready. I met Marlene at her office again and signed the last of the documents. She looked them over, then glanced up at me. "Would you like me to send formal notice?" "No," I said. "They'll learn soon enough." On Tuesday evening, Nathan and Jenna arrived without calling. I heard the car doors outside, then the knock. I thought for a moment about pretending I wasn't home. But I opened the door and stepped aside so they could come in. Nathan walked in first, followed by Jenna. Neither of them looked relaxed. I noticed they didn't sit down immediately, as though unsure how to position themselves. "We were hoping to talk," Nathan said. I nodded and gestured toward the living room. I remained standing until they finally sat. "We're confused," he said. "You canceled the trip, froze the cards, and haven't responded to anything. What happened?" I looked at him calmly. "You used my name to make a $42,000 charge without my permission. We were going to pay you back." "You didn't ask," I said. "You assumed." Jenna shifted in her seat. It felt time-sensitive. "We just thought." "I know what you thought," I said, without raising my voice. "You thought I wouldn't say no." Nathan leaned forward, trying to steer the conversation. "We were excited. And yes, maybe we jumped ahead, but this feels like a disproportionate response. You've helped us with so many things. I didn't think this would be different." I looked at him, and for the first time, I let my face show exactly what I felt. "It's not just about this. It's about everything." The years of requests that came without gratitude. The expectation that I would always say yes. The way I've been treated like a resource, not a person. Jenna didn't respond immediately, but I could see she was holding herself back. "I'm pregnant," she said finally. "We thought you'd want to know. We thought you'd want to be part of this." "I read your email." Nathan spoke again. "This doesn't have to be a fight. We can figure this out together." "I'm not fighting with you," I said. "I'm establishing boundaries. You don't have access to my finances anymore. If you need support, you're welcome to ask. But you don't get to assume it." There was a long pause. Nathan looked like he wanted to argue, but instead he sat back, his arms crossed. "So what does this mean?" he asked. "You're cutting us off." "No," I said. "I'm removing automatic access." "That's different. You're both adults. You can live your lives and make your choices. But those choices won't be built on the belief that I'm here to underwrite them." Jenna stood first. She didn't look angry. She looked tired. "Come on," she said to Nathan. "We've said what we came to say." He hesitated, then rose to follow her. At the door, he turned back. "I hope you reconsider. For the baby's sake." I looked at him and nodded once. "So do I." They left. I didn't follow them to the door. The room felt different afterward. Not lighter, exactly. But still. I made myself a cup of tea and took it into the den, where I sat near the window and watched the garden. The roses needed pruning again. The ivy had started to creep along the fence. There was work to do, as always. But for the first time in years, none of it felt like a burden. A week passed without another word. No calls, no messages, no unexpected visits. I didn't know if they were angry, embarrassed, or simply recalibrating. I suspected it was a mix of all three. I spent the days quietly, returning to routines I'd let slip. I took long walks in the neighborhood, stopping to talk with neighbors I hadn't seen in months. I cleaned out the upstairs linen closet and donated 2 full bags of towels and sheets to the shelter. I started sleeping through the night again, something I hadn't done in a long time, though I hadn't realized it until the dreams returned, soft, uneventful dreams that left me rested instead of tense. I didn't miss them. Not in the way I might have expected. I missed the idea of them. The hope I used to carry that we were still close. That I was part of something. But the reality, the way our relationship had actually felt for years, I didn't miss that at all. It had always come with a quiet sense of being used, of having to prove my worth through giving. Without that, the house was still and calm. I didn't feel lonely. I felt private. The mail came late Thursday morning. I wasn't expecting anything, bills, probably, but in the middle of the stack was a thick envelope with no return address. I opened it at the kitchen table. Inside were several neatly typed pages. Legal language. A refund confirmation from the travel agency, a final statement from the yacht company, and a formal letter from a law office in the city. Jenna and Nathan had consulted a lawyer. The letter said they disputed the characterization of the charges as unauthorized, and maintained that prior verbal understandings constituted implicit consent. But they were not pursuing the matter further. The tone was firm, not aggressive, as though it had been written as a warning more than a threat. I read it carefully, then folded it and placed it in the drawer with the others. I didn't respond. They wanted me to know they'd consulted a lawyer. They wanted me to feel watched. But there was nothing to respond to. I had already spoken with my own attorney, and every action I took was documented, legal, and private. They could posture if they wanted. That was their business. The next day I received a message from Jenna. It was polite and formal. "We hope you're well. We understand you've made your position clear, but wanted to check whether you'd be open to discussing how we move forward as a family. We recognize that recent events have been difficult. We are trying to learn from this. Please let us know if you're open to a conversation." I read it twice. I could see her effort to be composed, measured, respectful. I didn't doubt that she had rewritten it several times. And I also knew that behind every sentence was a question they wouldn't say out loud. Would I forgive them? Would I resume my old role? Would I let them back in? I sat with the message for a day. Then I responded with a short note. "Thank you for your message. I appreciate the gesture. At this time, I'm still reflecting and not ready to have that conversation. I wish you well. Nothing more. Nothing cruel. Just a clear answer." I expected that would be the end of it for a while. But 2 days later, Nathan called again. This time, I answered. "Hi, Mom." "Hello, Nathan." He sounded tired. "I got your message to Jenna." "Yes. Do you really think we've just used you? Is that what you believe?" I paused. "I believe I've been treated more like a financial institution than a parent for several years. I believe my boundaries haven't been respected. And I believe that now that I've stopped offering help automatically, you're not sure how to relate to me." "That's not how it feels from our side," he said quickly. "We were overwhelmed. We assumed. But we weren't trying to take advantage. But you did. Over and over. Whether you meant to or not, the result is the same." There was a long silence. "I don't want to lose you over this," he said finally. "You already lost the version of me who never said no," I replied. "That's not coming back." He didn't respond right away. I could hear him breathing. "I'm going to be a father," he said. "I know. I don't want my child to grow up with this hanging over us." "Then be different," I said. "How?" "Start by apologizing without justifying. Then stop assuming I'll rescue you from the consequences of your decisions. Then accept that love is not the same thing as giving endlessly." Another silence. "I don't know if I can do all of that." "I know. I'll try. Then we'll see." We ended the call quietly. Not resolved, but not in pieces either. I sat for a long time after that, looking at the light moving across the living room floor. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired, but in a clean way, like the kind of tired you feel after clearing out a room that's been cluttered for years. That evening, I took out a blank notebook and wrote one sentence across the top of the first page. What do I want now? Not for Nathan. Not for Jenna. Not for the baby. For me. It was a question I hadn't asked in a long time. Most of my adult life had been about what other people needed. Richard's job transfers. Nathan's school options. Jenna's career breaks. I had always shaped myself around other people's priorities. Now there was space. I made tea and sat at the kitchen table, listening to the wind against the windows. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like someone whose value came from how much she gave. I didn't feel like I owed anyone anything just to keep their affection. I thought about the old friend I used to visit in Maine before Richard's health declined. I thought about the long overdue trip to Vancouver to see the coastal gardens I'd always admired in photographs. I thought about the villa in Portugal that I'd bookmarked years ago, before Nathan and Jenna's second loan request, and then quietly forgotten. I could go, if I wanted to. I had the time. I had the means. And now, finally, I had the permission I never used to give myself. I didn't make any decisions that night. But I left the notebook open, and the question stayed there. What do I want now? The next morning, I woke early and opened the windows. The air was sharp and cool, and the garden was wet from last night's rain. I walked out barefoot and stood in the grass. The earth was cold against my skin. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. I wasn't young. But I wasn't finished. Let me know when you're ready for the next part. I started making plans the following week, quietly, without announcement. I didn't tell Nathan or Jenna. I didn't even tell my neighbor, who often noticed when I wasn't around for a day or two. I'd booked a flight and a modest hotel in Reykjavik, Iceland, not a trip I'd ever imagined taking when Richard was alive, but one I had often read about in travel magazines, always flipping the page as if dreams like that belonged to someone else. The idea had come to me the day I was cleaning out the laundry room. I found an old map in a drawer, folded around the corners, something Richard had picked up from a travel expo back when we still talked about taking trips. Iceland had been his idea, not mine at first. But I'd kept the brochure, and over time, the thought had stuck. Quiet beauty, a cold place where the silence meant something different. I wanted to be somewhere where I didn't have to explain anything to anyone. I booked everything in my own name, paid for in full, and created a separate email account to handle the confirmations. Not because I was hiding, just because I wanted something that belonged only to me. A few days before I was due to leave, I told Marlene, my attorney, and gave her a copy of my itinerary. She smiled and said, "About time." I packed lightly. I brought only what I needed, a few layers, a proper coat, 2 books, and one old photograph of Richard and me, taken on our back porch 15 years ago. I wasn't bringing it for sentiment. I just wanted to remember who I had been before everything got tangled. Back when love still felt easy, before it turned into obligation and expectation. The airport was busy, but I moved through it calmly. I felt no nerves, no second thoughts. When the plane lifted off the ground, I watched the landscape shrink beneath me and didn't feel loss. I felt detachment. Like I was finally observing my own life from the outside and realizing how small a part of the world it had been. I arrived in Reykjavik early in the morning. The air was colder than I expected, crisp and dry, with a kind of clarity that made the sky feel closer. The hotel was simple but clean. I had a view of the mountains and, if I stood close to the window, I could see the edge of the harbor. For 3 days, I did nothing structured. I walked. I visited cafes where no one knew me. I sat for hours with a cup of strong coffee, watching people come and go. I toured the public gardens and stood in the steam at the geothermal pools. I went to bed early, woke up late. I felt anonymous, and I liked it. There was one morning, halfway through the trip, when I found myself at the edge of a rocky beach. The water was dark, slate-colored, and still. A few locals were walking dogs, their voices low and unhurried. I took off my gloves and sat on a bench, letting the cold settle into my skin. That's when I realized I hadn't thought about Nathan or Jenna in over a day. Not in anger, not in longing. I simply hadn't thought about them. It wasn't that they didn't matter anymore. It was that they no longer controlled the temperature of my days. That was freedom. I wrote a postcard to myself and mailed it from a small shop in the city center. On the front was an image of the northern lights, and on the back I wrote, "You kept waiting for someone to let you go. But you didn't need permission. You just needed to stop waiting." I returned home quietly, just as I had left. The house felt different, not emptier, but less expectant. I put my suitcase away and made tea. The answering machine had 2 messages. One from a pharmacy, one from Jenna. I deleted both without listening. The next morning, I unpacked slowly, returning each item to its place. When I reached the photograph of Richard and me, I hesitated. I looked at it carefully. We were younger then. My hair was longer. His smile still intact. We looked like a couple who didn't yet understand how much could change. I placed the photograph in the drawer beside my bed and closed it. Later that week, I received another email from Jenna. It was longer than the last. She wrote about the pregnancy, about their plans for the baby, about the classes she had signed up for. Then she said something unexpected. I realize now that I've never truly seen you outside of your role as a supporter. I don't think I've ever asked what you wanted. I'm not asking now because I expect anything. I'm just writing to say I understand, more than I did before, why you did what you did. It wasn't perfect. It didn't erase everything. But I recognized the effort, and that mattered more than the words themselves. I didn't reply. Not because I was holding a grudge, but because I wasn't ready to be anything yet, not a grandmother, not a helper, not a trusted confidant. I was still deciding what I wanted to be next. And I wasn't going to rush just because they had finally slowed down. I returned to my routines. I replanted the herb garden. I started seeing a retired teacher friend once a week for coffee. I dug out an old box of sewing supplies and surprised myself by wanting to finish a quilt I had started years ago. It didn't feel like finding myself. It felt like finding the time to stop proving anything to anyone. Occasionally, I'd think about the baby. I'd wonder what kind of child it might be. Whether it would have Nathan's eyes or Jenna's way of tilting her head when she was trying to be clever. I didn't feel distant from it. But I also didn't feel called to it, not yet. One afternoon in early spring, I received a small package in the mail. There was no return address, but I recognized the handwriting. Inside was a book, a journal, blank inside, with a soft leather cover. Tucked inside the first page was a note from Nathan. I don't know what you're writing these days, but I imagine it's good. If you ever want to share it, I'll read every word. Love, N. It was the first thing he'd sent in months that didn't ask for anything. I placed the journal on my desk. I didn't open it. Not right away. That evening, I sat on the porch with a glass of wine. The sky was beginning to darken, and the air smelled like damp earth and the first hint of new grass. I thought about all the years I had waited to be appreciated, to be acknowledged, to be asked. And now that I had stopped waiting, I finally felt visible. Not to them. To myself. Let me know when you're ready for the final part. Spring passed gently, without ceremony. I spent most days outside, tending to the garden or walking down to the lake near the edge of town. The water was still cold, but the path had dried out enough for a steady walk. I started wearing my old sun hat again, the one Richard used to tease me about. I didn't wear it for nostalgia. I wore it because it kept the sun out of my eyes and I didn't need a new one. The journal Nathan had sent stayed on my desk for weeks. Not because I was hesitant to write in it, but because I didn't want to treat it like a symbol. I wanted it to be useful, not sentimental. I didn't want my thoughts to perform forgiveness or distance or strength. I wanted to be honest, and I couldn't do that if I was still thinking about who might eventually read it. Eventually, one Sunday morning, I opened it. I wrote one line at the top of the page: "You don't need to be understood by everyone to understand yourself." Then I closed it and went back to the day. Jenna's pregnancy moved along. I didn't ask for updates, but they came anyway, small and controlled. A few photos of baby clothes folded in neat rows. A picture of the nursery wall painted soft green. An image of an ultrasound, captioned only with the due date. It wasn't a flood of contact, just enough to make sure I knew I was being kept in the loop. They didn't ask me to help. They didn't ask me to come over. I wondered if they were trying to respect my space or simply unsure of the rules now. I wasn't keeping distance to punish anyone. I was keeping distance because I didn't want to return to old patterns under a new name. I had no interest in being pulled into a new chapter that still carried the tone of the last one. I wanted to make room for something different. If that didn't happen, then I would live a different kind of life, and that, finally, was okay with me. In late June, the baby was born. Nathan called me that afternoon. I saw his name on the screen and let it go to voicemail. Later, I sat on the porch and listened to his message. He sounded tired but calm. He said it was a girl, born early that morning, healthy and strong. He said Jenna was resting and doing well. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't ask me to come. He just told me her name, Clara, and said, "If you'd like to see a picture, I can send one." That was it. No expectations. Just the facts. I sat with the message for a long time before I did anything. Then I walked back inside and wrote out a card. Just a simple note: "Congratulations. I hope you're all doing well. Wishing your daughter a peaceful, loving start to life." I signed my name, addressed the envelope, and mailed it the next morning. A week passed before I heard anything else. Then Nathan called again, and this time I picked up. "Hi, Mom." "Hello, Nathan." There was a pause. "We'd like you to meet her. If you're open to it." "When?" "Whenever you're ready. No pressure. We just thought you might want to." He didn't press. He didn't explain why he was asking now. I said yes, and we agreed on a time. I didn't prepare much. I wore a clean blouse and pants, the same thing I might wear to lunch with a friend. I didn't bring a gift. I didn't stop at the florist or the bakery. I didn't want to show up performing gratitude or emotion. I just wanted to show up as myself. When I arrived, Jenna answered the door. She looked exhausted in a way that wasn't just from lack of sleep. But she smiled, small and polite, and stepped aside to let me in. Nathan was already in the living room, standing near the baby, who lay asleep in a bassinet by the window. They didn't fuss. No hugs, no speeches. They offered me a seat. We all sat quietly for a moment. "She's a good sleeper," Jenna said softly. "We're lucky." I nodded. They asked if I wanted to hold her. I looked at Clara, small, quiet, pink-cheeked, and then back at them. "Not yet," I said. "I'm happy just being here." Jenna nodded, and I saw her shoulders relax just a little. We talked for a while. Not about the past. About the baby. About feedings, diapers, new routines. Simple, ordinary things. I asked a few questions, nothing too deep. I listened more than I spoke. And as we talked, I felt the air shift. Not a breakthrough, just a softening. Before I left, Nathan walked me to the door. "I know we've got work to do," he said. "You do," I said. "So do I." He looked at me directly. "I don't expect this to fix everything." "It doesn't. But it's something." "Yes," I said. "It is." We didn't hug. He opened the door and let me out into the afternoon sun. I walked home, steady and unrushed. That evening, I sat on the porch again with a cup of tea. The air smelled like cut grass and dry earth. I thought about Clara. I thought about the way she looked in her sleep, peaceful, unaware of the history that surrounded her. And I realized something important. I didn't need to be central to her life to care about her. I didn't need to be the grandmother they expected, or the one they wanted, to still be part of her world. I just had to be honest, consistent, and clear about who I was now. A week later, they invited me back. This time, I brought a small hand-knitted blanket from a box in my closet, one I'd made years ago but never gifted. I didn't explain where it came from. I just laid it across the back of the couch. Jenna noticed but didn't say anything right away. As I was getting ready to leave, she touched the corner of it. "Did you make this?" "Yes. It's beautiful." "Thank you." A few weeks after that, I visited again. And then again. Slowly, the rhythm began to form. Not daily. Not out of duty. But something that felt for the first time in a long time, mutual. One day, Clara was awake when I arrived. Jenna handed her to me, and I held her gently, her tiny fingers curling against mine. She stared up at me with wide, blinking eyes. I didn't feel emotional. I didn't feel overwhelmed. I felt calm. She didn't know who I was yet. She didn't understand what had come before. She just saw a face, a voice, arms that held her without shaking. That was enough for now. That night, I wrote in the journal again. I won't disappear into this role. But I will stay, on my own terms. That's the only kind of presence I have to offer, and it's enough. I meant it. For the first time in many years, I felt like a woman whose presence wasn't tied to her usefulness. I felt like someone they had to get to know all over again, not because I was new, but because I had finally stopped hiding behind giving. There was no apology that erased the past. There was no perfect moment that made it all worthwhile. But there was this, a beginning. And that was more than I'd hoped for.